Thank you so much, Neil Farr. And special thank you to the folks at CPhI. It was a pleasure to meet Rutger, and I appreciate your hosting the talk today in this inaugural meeting in North America, where I think everyone, not everyone, but many are learning for the first time about CPhI as an organization and what value it can bring. And as I understand, 2/3 of the participants here are participating for the first time in a CPhI event, and that's pretty extraordinary, actually. Also, special thanks to Magid, whom I've had the pleasure to meet before today, and always a pleasure to hear him speak. My talk today is not so much about USP as about medicine quality. And it's taking a bit of a different view, a bit of a step back of where we are and where we're going in the quality space when you look at quality of medicines globally. And in particular, I'll tell the story, if you will, through the lens of partnership, and in particular, the partnership with industry, and in particular, the partnership between USP and industry, and a little bit of that history. 200 in 2020, so that reflects our 200th anniversary, which will be coming up in just a couple of years. In 1820, USP was founded on a premise of improving the quality of medicines. The challenges at that time were several in medicine space, but two really rose to the top. First, to any of the English in the room, I'll apologize here, but England was dumping its lowest quality medicine on the US market. It was a convenient place. They figured those colonists wouldn't really recognize a low quality medicine, but we did. The second part was that the country was barely a country. The states were really still forming, and the dominant mode of operation in the US was still by city. And in particular here in Philadelphia, Boston, and New York were really the leaders in regulation, if you will. It wasn't really called that, of course, but the physician community at that time was really in charge of deciding what a medicine even was, whether it was an herbal medicine or compounded drugs. And as much as we all appreciate physicians, I'm not sure how many of you know a physician that you trust to compound a medicine in their office today. Things certainly evolved, thankfully. One of the first steps in the evolution was this notion of a chemical medicine, which in 1820 was a bit of a novel concept where most of the drugs were herbally derived, not exclusively, but mostly. And that evolution from compounding in the physician's office to chemical medicines in closer to the modern sense was really then a shift from the physician to the pharmacist, and then the pharmacist, not so much as a shift, but the pharmacist and the growth of the pharmaceutical industry. In the growth of that industry then, rather than just thinking of the medicine as essentially a powder of an active ingredient, became the idea and the notion of formulation, certainly the addition of excipients as its own item to think about in terms of quality. Well, over the last 20 or 30 years, we've certainly gotten more specialized in the industry, and just a few of those areas, as we think of them from the USP perspective, dietary supplements, where we're not only thinking about quality, but also the role the consumer needs to play given the different regulatory environment, and USP's work in things like the essentially how do we help to certify, how do we help to work with consumers and build the consumer confidence that the products that they're receiving are of the quality that they expect. Global public health is a very different dimension. This is one where our work at USP, and certainly many of our partners around the world at USAID, the WHO, and others, are building the regulatory systems from the ground up in developing markets to be able to do the monitoring of the drug supply in those countries, in those markets. This is extremely important, and you see the data that we won't go into today in detail. But the percentages of substandard and counterfeit medicines in dozens of countries around the world, in particular in Southeast Asia and in sub-Saharan Africa, exceed 40 to 50% of the medicine supply is substandard or counterfeit. So these are numbers that are unfathomable to someone in a Western country today, and yet they're very real, and they threaten not only healthcare but also public trust. Food ingredients, and food fraud is an area that USP is spending more of our mind share. It's extremely important and won't be focus of today's talk, but in spaces like this, you think of foods, you don't usually think of health as a first cut, but when you think about safety of food ingredients and the potential issues with food fraud, then health becomes a very primary dimension, and certainly quality does as well. Healthcare quality standards, this again is a USP phrase. What we mean here are those standards that affect the very last step of the medicine journey. So the end of the supply chain, the prescription itself, the delivery by the pharmacist. In this space, we include the compounding, which is happening really closer to the site of care, packaging and labeling, even naming, things that affect that last step in the supply chain. Sometimes overlooked, and yet that last step in a developed market is still important. And in developing markets where we don't have networks of pharmacies, the last step can actually become the most important barrier to receiving a quality medicine. So don't get too excited. This isn't the end of the talk. This is actually a thank you to industry for years of collaboration. Just to give a kind of a sense of the numbers, USP has hundreds of volunteers, the majority of which come from the pharmaceutical industry in the US and abroad. The companies themselves, of course, allow those experts to spend their time with USP, and their commitment to us is for five-year commitments, ongoing basis, and the majority of which actually stay for more than one 5-year cycle. So it's an enormous donation to public health through the work with USP. In supporting those, hundreds of volunteers are now well over 1,000 USP staff members in the laboratory and otherwise to help support that work, that quality work as we move forward. So a special thank you to industry, and this is obviously this event, CPhI in general, but CPhI Connect here in North America is a great opportunity for us to network, and many of our staff at USP will be here and on the shop floor over the next few days. So thank you again. So it's a big word, quality. This is where Terry, who's here in the front row, will be very pleased to hear me talk about this. She's our head of quality at USP. So when you're the head of quality at USP, you have kind of a tall job. What does quality mean for us? Nilüfer spoke a little bit. She didn't say what she was, but some of the words she was sharing were of our 4 core values at USP. And one of those core values is passion for quality. And we chose that word deliberately because it isn't just enough to recognize it or even to respect it, but it's to have a drive for it that can never be really satisfied. It's a never-ending journey. So quality is woven into so much that we do at USP. But the next few slides, I'll talk a little bit about what does it mean to others, and what do we do to advocate for the value and the importance of quality in medicines today. So the USP Quality Institute, this is a new idea that we'll be launching just this year. It's underway. We're getting it underway just now. And this is the goal of this institute is to answer one single question, to describe the actual value of quality. If asked a certain way, nobody would say that low-quality medicines are okay or better than high-quality medicines. But the real value of this research is going to come in helping to make the case, for example, if a finance minister is meeting with a minister of health in a developing country, and they're making a choice. They have a fixed number of resources and very high medicine needs in the country. They're making trade-offs and choices, often between quality and quantity. What is the cost of that trade-off? What is the right trade-off to make? What are the effects of low-quality medicines in a marketplace? We'll talk a couple about ideas later that come through. It's not just the negative side, but it's also the positive side of creating a fair marketplace of quality, which can foster competition, which drives higher quantities of medicine overall and affordable prices. So our Quality Institute is taking something a little bit outside of our USP everyday and into answering some bigger, broader questions, which we'll do exclusively through partnerships and fellowships. The first topic we'll be exploring, and Magid touched on this very, very briefly on one of his slides, is AMR. So the primary drivers for AMR, which is extremely serious and very current, not future, but very current trend in the world today, is driven by overuse and poor adherence. Those are clear and proven linkages. Less proven, but we believe equally important, is the effect of substandard and counterfeit medicines that are being perhaps taken the appropriate way, but not having the effects that they're supposed to have. So we're going to study the effect of quality specifically on antimicrobial resistance. And our hypothesis is that it may not be the single biggest contributor, but it may be the most addressable. We have the tools, we know how to do this, and that makes it, we think, quite attractive. So what are these broader challenges when you think about quality medicines in the world today? Just three very quick things to look at the landscape. So everybody at every probably day going back to the 1400s, we're talking about the Netherlands and early trade. The world has been globalizing since the first human stood up on its two legs, I imagine. So that's not new. What is perhaps new? Some recent trends are interesting. The industry at the highest levels consolidates, and you saw it, Magid's chart showing the number of companies. But if you look a little closer, you'll see that in the total pharmaceutical chain, the fastest growing segment of the pharma business today are mid-sized companies spread all around the world across dozens of countries. This is interesting, dynamic, exciting, and also creates even more complexity on an already complex marketplace. In the regulation space, the development rate of regulatory authorities in smaller or in developing countries has been accelerating very rapidly just about the last 5 years. This is overwhelmingly a positive. However, it does introduce new thinking. Those regulators will sometimes, but not always, be consistent with existing regulatory systems. So it creates more complexity for global industry, global organizations. And lastly, and I'll talk a little bit about this later in the talk, just innovation overall. And innovation means different things to different people. If you think of it from a sense of quality of medicines, we're talking about innovations in manufacturing, supply chain monitoring and surety, and even the technologies themselves, the kind of medicines that then challenge your assumptions of what quality even means. So, quality in developing markets. Take a moment to think about this. As you look at the growth, and when Magid shared that the pharma industry is looking to biologics, that's absolutely true, specialty medicines in general, but also true is they're looking to new markets. The US market is growing slowly. Europe is only growing at a few percent a year from total pharmaceutical sales. But other countries, people of course know the story for China, but there are other countries like Indonesia, for example, where the growth rate is double digits and could remain that way for many years. So what are the unique challenges in the developing markets, and what can we do to be focusing on medicine quality from the beginning rather than addressing it on the back end? USP has begun a partnership with APEC, and we have existing and ongoing partnerships in Africa through the African Union and its related bodies to work collectively to start by being as consistent and harmonized as possible from the beginning. The work in APEC is very, very interesting. We've become a center of excellence in training on medicine quality. Covers really 4 areas. One is the standards themselves. It's the easiest piece, and it's available and publicly available already. More challenging but very important are areas of GMP, GDPs, basically ICH overall. What do best practices look like? And adhering closer to that will automatically bring regulators in closer alignment. Screening and detection technologies. This is not just modern and new technologies, but existing ones as well. How to have access. Every country cannot build up a US FDA or an EMA within a country. But they have to have the same level of protection. So what networks do they access? What kind of partnerships across countries? Hence the notion of APEC as a collaborative group. And then lastly, and this is really not one, but as an example, things like internet pharmacies. So things that are new challenges in Europe or the US are essentially also new challenges when everything is new. But they create a challenge or a barrier to some of the things they would like to do in a positive sense. But they also present a huge opportunity in regions or countries in the world where you don't have an already established network of pharmacies, for example. So that becomes a very exciting opportunity, but one that's fraught with challenges. So the fact that the regulatory landscape is changing, probably not a shock to anybody in this room. The question is, what does it mean for quality? Or as I say, one of the questions is, what does it mean for medicine quality? One thing we would pose, and it goes with the theme of CPhI Connect very strongly, is that as dozens of more markets come online and the world is less dominated by any one market or even any one regulator, it requires more collaboration, more engagement. despite all the technological advances, until you've seen someone face to face and you've had a conversation, it's hard to do that. So this is stressing an importance of both regional as well as global organizations to really bring together for these discussions up front to avoid having to fix things on the backside. So what drives that need? What else is going on at the same time? Where are medicines going in the future? So let me just share a few things that are very real happening today that we think have significant implications on quality, some positive, some challenges. Manufacturing changes, actually the graphics don't line up very well, so don't focus on those too much. Manufacturing changes, we're talking about things like continuous manufacturing. How do you think about data in a quality by design world? Even things like 3D printing is just a different way to create a tablet. Those create a different way to both improve quality, track more and more data, but also open up many, many questions for which the regulators that already exist and those that are still coming up to speed are clearly not ready to accept. The lack of regulatory readiness will actually inhibit, or we believe will inhibit, move to those technologies, but we support them because they have been proven to create better opportunities for higher quality medicine. So USP will do what we can, and we hope many of you will, to work together to enhance and to support those new technologies, not see them as a threat, but see them as an opportunity. Another area is in what I would just call the digital health medicine interface. In the simplest sense, if you think about the degree of monitoring, in areas like diabetes, it's already here fully today, where insulin pumps hooked up to, obviously, an insulin, and then also linked up to blood glucose monitors in a single system, and yet not produced together. In these systems, those three products are manufactured independently with their own approval pathways. They don't need to be certified to work together in any way. It's mix and match. So the question is, if the pharmaceutical industry spent $2 billion to create an insulin that's been proven safe and effective and proven over many years to work, and then it's hooked up to a digital device that was created in a laboratory, in a computer lab in San Francisco with no knowledge of the pharmaceutical space, how well do we know that drug is being delivered in the right way? And if it isn't, $2 billion of wasted money to create a high quality medicine not being delivered properly. So digital health is exciting, but it also creates a whole new set of interfaces and a new set of experts who don't know the healthcare space the way CPhI Connect members will. New therapies in personalized medicine. And personalized medicine, which was actually my work at Biogen, doesn't mean much, it's more of an approach. But if you think about the kind of therapies we mean, smaller and smaller patient populations, perhaps different dosages, certainly different types of formulations and delivery, it challenges not the idea of having a high quality, but in defining what quality is when standardization is not the key. In fact, standardization is what you don't want in personalized medicine. So you have a different definition of standardization. How will we monitor quality? And that isn't even to consider what does a generic look like in a personalized medicine space. So you're personalizing medicine, you're adding multiple different drugs. It's something to think about, and it's not, again, not in the future. It's already here today. In drug delivery, and I think about Fred's talk coming up, talking about nanoparticles, I would also expand that to novel excipients. Just other ways of thinking about delivery has also implications on quality and new challenges when you think about different drugs and comparing across when these technologies are different. How do you consider quality? What does the patient have to think about? And certainly in the biosimilar space, there are scientific questions. There are even larger regulatory questions about where we go long term. It's one thing to have one or two biosimilars approved, but what does it look like if there are 12? How does a prescriber make a choice between 12 products which are similar but not the same? What does that even mean to the patient on a prescription by prescription basis? It's not, the system as we have it today is not scalable to what we'll have in 10 or 15 years. So that's the hard part. But the good news is that there are a lot of opportunities for partnership. The USP was founded we were a partnership in our founding. So in 1820, there were 11 physicians, three of whom were U.S. senators, and therefore the founding ceremony was somewhat ceremoniously conducted in the U.S. Senate chamber on January 1st, 1820, which is a great date, easy to remember. I suspect they got it because who wants to be in the Senate chamber at work on January 1st? It was probably a cheap day to get the Senate chamber. But that was it was a partnership that expanded in the first 10 years to include especially the pharmacists, and then eventually, of course, with the birth and growth of industry in the US and in Europe, in particular in the early days, that was the entire founding was all about partnership. A partnership in and around quality, and ultimately in and around quality to help ensure patients get the drugs that they need. The complexity of the pharmaceutical marketplace is such that a patient, even a well-informed patient, is completely and absolutely not equipped to be able to monitor their own quality. There are certain things they'll have to do to be diligent, but it's not acceptable to expect them to look at a tablet and say, yes, I believe that this is a high-quality drug. So therefore, it comes to us to collectively be able to do that on their behalf. So the question I ask, and this I guess you could look at the telescope here, but as we look forward, as we think about the future, what does it mean? We at USP are trying to put forward a dialogue and a definition of the quality in the medicine space that thinks about the quality not just of the day-to-day medicines you're taking here, but quality in the way we even think about new technologies, how they roll out, and how they can be most effective and cost-effective for patients. So we're optimistic. We're excited to be partnering and working together. We're partnered with industry now in the areas of continuous manufacturing, and we're adding new partnerships in nanotechnology and many others as we go, so that we can be there to help along the way and not just arrive on the back end. So I say now the real thank you. Thank you to all of you. I appreciate your time here today, and certainly welcome to take any questions if you have any.
Thank you. Hi, good morning, Ron. My name is Bob Miglani. I was with Pfizer for 23 years, and I left recently and I joined a small company. And at Pfizer, quality is number one, very important. I'd like your sense, as I entered the sort of supply chain world, quality has a different definition, especially if you go to different parts of the world. And a slice of that, I suppose, is this notion of authenticity. And I use the example of supplements.
Yeah.
And the Attorney General of New York looking at the DNA of the raw ingredient in a bottle of a supplement and declaring that there wasn't enough of the active raw ingredient in the supplement itself. And so we're struggling. I'm sort of trying to get a sense from this notion of quality with this new world we live in, where we're increasingly talking about authenticity. And so can you give us a sense of the challenges? I applaud USP, I really do. I have a great deal of respect for the organization. But as we look into the future, this is one of the core challenges I see increasingly is this, quality or is it authentic? There's just so much, the counterfeits of pharma, of the challenges in the supply chain, a vast and global supply chain. So if you can give us a sense of that, Ron, I appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Thank you. So a couple of things. We think that, everybody has to take the perspective from where they sit, and because of our stakeholders, we try as best as we can to put ourselves in the shoes of our stakeholders, practitioners, industry, and regulators as well, and see what does it look like from their angle. So scientifically, and I do this, I ask my scientists all the time, they don't really care. They do, of course, when they know the bigger picture, but ultimately, scientifically, there is no such thing as authenticity. It's their chemical measurements, it's the NMR results. But in real life, it does matter. It does make a difference. And the New York Attorney General case in supplements, without going into details, what was even more interesting is how you define quality even goes broader than that definition. So it turned out that the test that the Attorney General used, they made it up. They found a nearby professor. They asked a set of questions, but weren't really the right questions. They ran a good test for the wrong reason. They tested for genetic material. The dietary supplement was produced through a method to remove all genetic material as a part of the purification. So they were essentially looking for an impurity, which they didn't find very much of. So maybe that's good. Other testing that we know of showed that actually that dietary supplement was of poor quality, but not for the reason that was said. Actually, that was one thing it probably did reasonably well, was remove the genetic material. So I guess what I'm getting to is the sophistication. It is to simply say something is authentic isn't sufficient, as you say, but it's at least a step, and it's a required step before moving on to a level of quality. So by our definition of quality, it needs to be both authentic and produced in a way such that it can give you the expected outcome on a reliable basis anywhere around the world. And so therefore, it's not just what's produced, but how it arrives, how it's been shipped and stored and dispensed. It has to include things like directions on the label for use, because if you use, we recently, USP worked to remove the teaspoon in the US marketplace. No more teaspoons. Because the degree was about, I think about a 300% variation in people at home literally using their teaspoon with viscous liquids. They were creating, people were serving a tablespoon of medicine. It was terrible. It sounds like a silly thing, but how good the medicine is if you're giving 3 times the dose at the end for something like a cough medicine, it could be very serious, actually. So we're passionate about quality at USP. We're kind of dorks in that way, but we're proud of that. And we hope to get the conversation out there to say, please don't consider only quantity. Please don't consider only cost or access. Think about quality. Think about that as a minimum bar, which everyone should expect. Thank you.
Hi, thanks. I have a question about you, if you can expand a little bit more on, you talked briefly about partnerships and rapid development, and I'm curious if you can go into a little more detail on, to say the evolution of smart devices.
Yep.
And pharmaceuticals, and who in particular is kind of leading the charge? What organizations are leading the charge to ensure greater connection between those things?
Great question. So just 2 weeks ago, I joined a conference out on the West Coast. It was tech companies. So I was just sort of quietly sneaking in the back of the room. Essentially, the answer is no. The short answer is nobody knows. What was most interesting, so I guess that's not, given where it is, maybe that's not surprising. What's very positive, the positive attitude I have is that where these technologies are developed, there's a lot of unknowns, risks, basically, and business risks. Business risks including things like safety and efficacy, but marketplaces, uncertain regulatory environment. What was raised was that topics like these are ones where having some basic, let's say, foundation of what we will agree on is absolutely essential, given all the other risks that they're taking. And one of the presentations was from a venture firm that was talking about its whole portfolio of digital health companies, and that they're looking at the de-risking of the portfolio before they go to second or third round investments. So that conversation really sort of triggering a lot of things in my head, and I came back to my staff very excited about a lot of these ideas, and we were saying that we may not perceive, we don't do our work in standards to promote quality for those reasons, but those reasons actually help reinforce what we're doing. So if somebody is able to take advantage of a quality standard to remove risk, more quickly advance to a product which is of higher quality, well, certainly our mission wins, and that industry is very excited. Now, that sounds like a great idea. What exactly is the work going to be? That will take some more time.
I guess the follow-up, how do they de-risk? What process do they go through?
So the follow-up is, how do they de-risk? Well, of course, they have to de-risk a lot of things. What was interesting in that meeting is that this isn't their number one risk, but it's pretty close to the top for many digital health companies, regulatory uncertainty, if taken very broadly. And in that case, regulatory doesn't even necessarily mean FDA, just broadly. So how do they de-risk? They don't know how to work with each other because digital health isn't an industry. It's an idea. There really isn't an industry. Certainly not anything nearly as cohesive as a pharma industry that has codes of conduct and all the things that have developed over many decades. Because of that, there's no natural convener. There isn't necessarily even that discussion of what they do share. If you're Omada Health, which has a digital connected scale for diabetes management, is radically different from an insulin pump manufacturer. But what do they share? Well, they have patient data. They have to make it safe and secure. The patient and the data will change people's drug habits. And so how do they ensure an integrity of data integrity between the two? So there are things that are fundamental, but so much of what they do is different. So they have to figure out what they really do want to partner on. Thank you very much.